Hey everybody, this is Andy Hall. You are watching the show. Today our guest is Professor Allan Lichtman. Allan Lichtman is a distinguished professor of history at American University and the author of many acclaimed books on U.S. political history, including White Protestant Nation, The Rise of the American Conservative Movement, FDR and the Jews with Richard Reitman, and The Case for Impeachment. He is regularly sought out by the media for his authoritative views on voting and elections. You may have seen Professor Lichtman on Bill Maher and read his articles on The Hill. Professor Lichtman, how are you doing today?
Staying healthy and staying happy so far. Mourning
Fantastic.
For all those afflicted by this, though.
Right. So you've been pretty much staying in and keeping yourself safe and healthy?
Absolutely, although I run 3 miles a day, but I stay away from everyone else.
Well, that's probably a good policy. So, Professor Lichtman, I just finished reading your book, Repeal the Second Amendment, The Case for a Safer America. It's a pretty remarkable book.
Absolutely. Look, I wrote that book because the NRA and the gun lobby has hijacked the Second Amendment, completely distorted its historical meaning and its purpose in the service of the gun makers and the gun sellers who provide so much revenue to the NRA. My purpose was to show the real history of the Second Amendment and gun control in America, to explain why the hijacked Second Amendment has become such a terrible barrier to reasonable gun controls that the vast majority of Americans support, and to show a pathway to repeal. You know, we tend to think, oh my God, it's impossible to repeal a constitutional amendment, but it's been done. The Prohibition Amendment was repealed. Many other elements of our Constitution, like election of senators by legislatures, have been changed. And, you know, the gun control movement's been stalled for 25 years. They've gotten nothing at the national level with their strategy of we support the Second Amendment. But I was inspired by the late, great Justice John Paul Stevens, who a couple of years ago wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying the only way to make real progress is through repeal of the Second Amendment.
Interesting. So I have to ask you, when you talk about the real Second Amendment, how does that differ from how we view the Second Amendment today?
Yes. I will cite a report from 1955, which says that the history of the Second Amendment and all court decisions demonstrate that the Second Amendment was designed for protection through collective security, through a well-regulated militia, not an individual right to keep and bear arms. That statement was written not by a gun control group, but by the constitutional expert, get this, for the National Rifle Association. So what happened? In the late 20th century, the National Rifle Association was taken over in the so-called revolt in Cincinnati in 1977 by a new and militant leadership, which decided, we're going to use the Second Amendment. Forget about what it really means. We're going to use it as a club to prevent all reasonable gun control legislation. Go back to the history. Not a single person, not one, involved in the drafting, the adoption of the amendment by Congress, or the ratification by the states said that the amendment protected an individual right to keep and bear arms. That's why the gun lobby has to turn to quotations from others, usually doctored and distorted, to change the meaning of the Second Amendment. Look, I know this doesn't reflect well on our founders, but here to me is the utterly clinching argument. Who drafted the Second Amendment? James Madison, a slaveholder. Numerous slave states and their representatives in Congress ratified the amendment. Do you think for one moment slaveholders like James Madison would have ratified an amendment that gave an unlimited right to bear arms to African Americans in the United States? Not for 1 second, but by tying it to collective security in a well-regulated militia, they prevented that because guess what? The militias in every state barred African Americans from being part of the militia. And every single federal court case, with one exception until 2010, including two major Supreme Court decisions, ratified the notion that the Second Amendment was designed only to protect the collective security through a well-regulated militia. That changed in 2010 when Justice Antonin Scalia bought into the NRA's argument. And you know what? Antonin Scalia was known, late great justice, as an originalist. Yes. You know, the most prominent originalist who believed in recovering the original purpose of the Constitution and its amendments. And yet, in his decision in the Heller case in 2010, he totally abandoned originalism because he couldn't find any original intent that supported his position. And even conservative commentators like Judge Richard Posner, the most cited legal theorist of the 20th century, slammed Scalia for abandoning originalism and reading his own personal political convictions into the Constitution, something which conservatives had blasted liberals for in decisions like Roe versus Wade on abortion rights.
I read that part of your book and I thought to myself, that is an incredible amount of hypocrisy on his part.
Absolutely, you know, and the problem is the Second Amendment stands not only as a club against all gun control, but now with the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, any national gun control measure is in jeopardy of being struck down. The court recently avoided dealing with a gun control case coming out of New York because New York had changed the law, but several of the justices wrote some pretty scathing dissents saying, you know, we should have considered this even though it was really moot. There were at least 4 justices for really going after gun control measures based on the Second Amendment. And, you know, we don't know what the swing justice, who's actually pretty conservative justice, John Roberts, might do.
Sure. Professor Lichtman, if there was an alien from another planet who came down here today and asked you, how bad is the gun problem in the United States of America, what would you tell them?
I would say it's astoundingly bad. Over 15,000 or about 15,000 gun murders in America each year. Over 23,000 gun suicides, something the NRA doesn't even want you to talk about. That's close to 40,000 gun violence deaths a year. It's more than are killed in vehicle accidents, to which we devote hundreds of millions of dollars to try to prevent. You know, to listen to the NRA, you would think, you know, among our peer democracies, we are the safest nation in the world. The truth is just the opposite. If you look at our peer democracies in the G7 group of nations, plus Australia, an American per capita, adjusted for population, is 20 times more likely to die from a gun murder. That's not 20%. That's 20 times more likely. We are 7 times more likely to die from gun suicides, whereas we're 40% less likely to die from other means of suicide. You know, the NRA, like President Trump, wants to put the blame on everything else. It's video games. It's mental health. But you know what? All of these other nations have violent video games. They have mental health problems. You know, the only difference is guns. They have strict gun control laws, and we don't. You know, in Japan, which arguably has the strictest gun control laws, last year, you know how many gun murders there were in Japan? 3.
No idea.
3 compared to 15,000 in the U.S. And, you know, Japan is notorious for its violent video games and its mental health issues.
It seems as if just having a gun in the house or a gun on you increases the chance of something horrible to happen.
That's right. People think guns, you know, protect you. It's not true. You are several times more likely to die or be injured by gun violence if you have a gun in the home. And, you know, the NRA says, well, you know, guns protect women. That's nonsense. Women are the victims of gun violence. And when there is a gun in the home, domestic violence is far more likely to turn deadly than when there is no gun in the home. And by the way, this is something no one has really talked about that I think I brought out in my book for the first time. When you look at a lot of these mass shootings, the targets were actually women. The targets were actually women who the murderous villains felt, they had been scorned by.
Yeah. Just pivot a little bit. Can you talk about the history of the NRA? I was reading through your book, and I found the relationship with the U.S. government, the military giving them weapons. I found that intriguing.
It's absolutely astounding. NRA was formed in 1871, not as an anti-gun control group or a Second Amendment group, but by Civil War veterans to improve the marksmanship of American militia and American soldiers. One of the early presidents of the NRA was actually the great general, former President Ulysses S. Grant. But the NRA was dying in the early 20th century. Its revenue was a few $1,000s. Its membership was diminishing. What saved the NRA? Socialism. Something the NRA, constantly rails against. After the Dick Act was passed in the early 20th century, ending essentially the militia system and establishing the National Guard, one of the semi-official offshoots of this legislation was the NRA, which was designated as sort of an official group to improve marksmanship. And as you say, they became the recipient of socialism, tremendous aid from the federal government, supplying them weapons, bullets, targets. And as I point out in my book, in the 1950s, the executive director of the NRA admitted we're a quasi-governmental organization sustained by governmental subsidies, which lasted well into the 20th century. So much for the hypocrisy of the NRA today, railing against big government and socialism. Socialism for the NRA was just fine.
Right, exactly. So today, how deep is the NRA into our politicians, into government?
Oh, it's deeply into our government. Just look at what President Trump has done. After the horrific massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, Trump promised us he would do something really strong against gun violence. And then guess what? He talked to the executive director of the NRA, changed his tune, and you know what he did? Absolutely nothing. And you know what we get from these NRA-connected politicians after every one of these horrific gun massacres? Thoughts and prayers, as if that was going to protect us and save us from the next horrific act of gun violence. And let's not forget, these gun massacres that, are horrific and traumatizing, they're but the tip of the iceberg of 40,000 gun violence deaths each year. And most of them, those deadly ones, are perpetrated by these semi-automatic weapons. In one tragedy, more than a dozen people were killed in less than a minute by one of these automatic weapons. So the idea, that some gun-toting person, out there in the mass that was being shot could somehow retrieve his gun, shoot down the person firing, 50 to 60 bullets a minute is ludicrous. It has almost never, ever happened.
I want to revisit the idea about repealing the Second Amendment. There's going to be a lot of people, and I'm sure you've heard them all or heard a lot of them, about this is absurd. Why don't we just do gun control measures?
Yeah, the answer is severalfold. First, the current strategy has failed. 25 years, we've gotten nothing. In fact, we've slid backwards at the national level. We had the repeal in 2004 of the automatic weapons ban. Some states like Connecticut have pioneered outstanding automatic weapons ban, but we know it has to be national because guns cross state lines. In fact, if you look at the tightest gun control states, the majority of weapons recovered in crime scenes are from out of state, from loose gun control states. And in addition to lapsing the automatic weapons ban, Congress also passed the shield legislation to shield gun makers and sellers, whoever irresponsible, from liability. So the current strategy has failed. It's not as if we have a successful strategy that we could keep going. Second, even if we don't achieve repeal, this will be a focus and an inspiration for a revived gun control movement. Third, you never know what's going to happen. 30 years ago, it would have seemed utterly impossible to legalize gay marriage in the United States. Only about 25 to 30% of Americans favor that. About the same percentage, by the way, that now favors repeal of the Second Amendment. Today, gay marriage is not only the law of the land, but over 60% support it. Back when Prohibition Amendment was passed, the smart pundits, just like the smart pundits today, were saying, there's not a snowflake's chance in hell that will ever repeal this amendment, but it was done. And finally, I'm an alum of Brandeis University, and the great Justice Louis Brandeis said, most of the worthwhile things that have been done in the world seemed impossible at the time.
Do you think a lot of it is just a lack of leadership?
I think it's a lack of leadership because, politicians are like Wall Street investors. They're driven by two things, greed and fear. There's just too much fear of the gun lobby and the NRA, which, by the way, the NRA has become an utter racket. It takes money from these, legitimate supporters of gun rights. And what does it do with it? It pays exorbitant salaries, way out of line with a so-called nonprofit. $1.4 million to its CEO, Wayne LaPierre, over $1 million to its number two, 7 or 8 getting $600,000 or more. Just outrageous. And it's had a lot of controversy because on top of this, there are perks like, Beverly Hills wardrobes, lavish trips. It's really become an absolute racket, but politicians are still fearful of the NRA and the gun lobby, and they're afraid of the club of the Second Amendment that the NRA has wielded. I would say the NRA hijacking, distorting, and use of the Second Amendment is probably the greatest public relations coup in the history of the United States, perhaps until the Russian interference in the 2016 election.
The idea that the Russians infiltrated the NRA.
Absolutely. The NRA is hand in glove with the Russians because the Russians understand the NRA. It's not just a gun lobby. It's also key to the conservative movement in the United States. And the Russians have been very interested in infiltrating the American conservative movement, and they've used the NRA as their tool and their prop.
So how do we organize a movement to repeal the Second Amendment?
That's why I wrote the book, to try to give gun control advocates the historical facts they need, not alternative facts, to launch a successful repeal movement. And that's why I'm on shows like yours, to try to explain why the only way we're going to get the reasonable gun controls and keep them safe from being struck down is through a repeal movement. The strategy, we support the Second Amendment, but doesn't work.
And that's what I found interesting about one of the points in the book, is that it's important to convince people who are already within your group, who are already Democrats or progressives, let's say, that this is the way to move forward before trying to convert people to the cause. Do I have that right?
You got 100% right. I hope I could convert some people to the cause, but obviously the real target audience, and we're talking 70, 80% of Americans who believe in things like assault weapons ban, universal background checks. That's the audience for this book, and it's an audience, of over 150 million people.
Indeed. So let's talk about some, at the end of the book, towards the end of the book, you talk about some real world gun control laws, regulations that really work. You want to just touch on a couple of them?
Let me preface this by saying, despite the scare tactics of the gun lobby, I nowhere advocate the confiscation of guns. Never happened, Not going to happen. And none of the reforms I propose are going to stop people from having guns for hunting, for sport, or if you really need them, for self-defense. So what am I talking about? A lot of the things, that Americans overwhelmingly support. Closing the loophole on background checks by having universal background checks. And I point out in my book the ways in which dangerous criminals have been able to get guns evading our very weak background check laws. A ban on high-caliber magazines and semi-automatic weapons. No one needs, for hunting, self-defense, or sport, a semi-automatic weapon capable of firing 50 to 60 rounds a minute. Such weapons are weapons of war. Their only use is to kill as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Gun safety storage laws, which have been found to, prevent gun accidents, which impact children specifically. Permit laws, like they have in many of our states. Laws designed to stop what is the new and great danger of gun violence, and that is the use of 3D printers to print untraceable, unregistered, undetectable kinds of guns. Red flag laws to keep guns out of the hands of people who are obviously a danger to themselves and to others. These are common sense measures supported by the overwhelming majority of Americans. They have been adopted by essentially every other peer democracy in the world and have made those places so much safer than the United States.
Before reading your book, I had never heard of a ghost gun.
Yes. A ghost gun is, the gun of the future. And the Trump administration, has pretty much let them come through unregulated. We have something called 3D printers, which, by the way, may be the wave of home manufacturing in the era of pandemics. But, the technology is advancing where you could print through your 3D printer your own gun at home, a ghost gun, untraceable, unregistered. The other loophole we need to close that I advocate is even for those who are banned from buying, say, semi-automatic weapons, you can still buy components. You can buy pieces. It's right there on the web, advertised, and with the most minimal of skills, you can put together your own equivalent of the AR-15. So those are the two types of ghost guns we need to regulate.
What I found interesting is that just having an in-person federal permit system, in other words, applying for the federal permit in person, actually lowers gun violence.
Correct. As I said, you really need national laws because guns scoot across state lines. But even absent that, I point out statistics in my book showing when you compare the top 5 gun control states, places like Massachusetts, to very loose gun control states. The gun control states, both gun murders and gun deaths per capita are but a small fraction of those in the loose gun control states. And that relationship holds when you control for, all other elements of gun crime and gun deaths. The statistics are overwhelming, just as the international comparisons are overwhelming. The gun lobby, Australia had this horrific mass shooting in the 1990s, and it responded with several very strong gun control laws. And the NRA responded with an ad saying, there will be blood in Australia with these gun control laws because defenseless criminals will be mowed down by criminals. Defenseless, law-abiding citizens, rather, will be mowed down by criminals. Well, since they put out this ad, gun deaths in the United States, gun murders, rather, have soared by several thousand. They slightly declined in Australia, and an American today is more than 20 times per capita more likely to be killed by a gun than a resident of Australia. So much for NRA propaganda.
So I want to ask you, in terms of really good states besides Massachusetts and Connecticut, what are some other states that get it right?
New York is another state that gets it pretty much right. They have a very strict permit law. I know people who carry handguns in New York. I'm from New York. And they all tell me, they went through the permit process, perfectly legitimate process. Wanted to make sure, they didn't have a criminal record or other signs of danger. And moreover, they had to go through gun safety training. Why in the world would we, have that for every state in the country? It utterly baffles me. And Connecticut has an outstanding assault weapons ban. Everybody says, or at least the gun lobby says, oh, you really can't ban assault weapons because you can't really define them. Nonsense. Check out my book and my citations to the Connecticut law. It is extremely explicit in exactly what constitutes semi-automatic weapons. And, we ban automatic weapons. And the one minor thing the Trump administration has done is banning so-called bump stocks that you can use to convert semi-automatic into automatic weapons. Meaningless. Just go to the web. There are loads of websites telling you how in just a very short period of time, without a bump stock, you can convert your semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon.
What are some groups people can join right now that fight the NRA and gun violence?
Yeah, of course, the major group is the Brady Group, named after James Brady, who recently passed away, who was grievously injured in the assassination attempt. Sarah Brady, is now the group. The Giffords Group, started by Gabby Giffords, who was gravely injured in a mass shooting, and Moms Against Gun Violence, started by mothers whose children were killed. Those are three terrific groups that, you could join.
Professor Lichtman, it'd be wrong for me to have you on the show since you are the author of the 13 Keys. And whenever you're on a show, people are going to ask you about the election.
Yes. You're about the 5,000th person to ask me.
Of course.
I'm going to give you an answer. Let me preface it by saying I haven't made a prediction yet. I hope to make it by the time the second quarter GDP comes out in July. However, let me say this. As compared to 4 months ago when things were looking pretty good on my 13 key system against Donald Trump was looking pretty good. It takes 6 keys to count out the incumbent party candidate, party holding the White House. Trump had only 4 keys out against him. Things look far worse for Donald Trump now, largely by his own making, largely by his utter failures to take strong action in time against this pandemic and prevent the meltdown of our economy. But right now, several other keys are in jeopardy as a result of the pandemic and the economic meltdown, and things look much worse for Donald Trump than they did a few months ago.
Indeed, that's what I was thinking too. I know in your book, 13 Keys to Winning the White House, no sitting president has won re-election during a recession, as I understand.
That's correct. And, I have 2 economic keys, which were not turned against Donald Trump 4 months ago, the recession key and the long-term economy key, both of which are now in severe jeopardy.
Right, because not all the keys are weighted the same. Those economic keys are pretty serious, are pretty important.
They're all weighted the same. That's the
okay.
Key. See, this is the secret. This is why so many of the big models, not just for elections, but for everything else, fail, because they have these weights. They have these parameters in them. And the problem is the weights are great for predicting past events. But the problem is the weights will unpredictably change the next event. I'm reminded of a group of very respectable University of Colorado professors. In 2012, were predicting a Mitt Romney landslide based upon a weighted equation where the weights had came from all previous elections. And of course, the weights had unpredictably changed and they were grievously wrong, and we haven't heard from them again.
I imagine if a model cannot predict the future, it's not a very useful model.
That's right. And I give no credence to models unless they have a long track record of predicting the future. My model has a track record going back to 1984. And every year I go out on a limb and publish and announce my predictions. And of course, I correctly predicted, did not endorse, but predicted Donald Trump's win in 2016. And we're here in my study, and I have on my wall this letter written on the Washington Post interview where I predicted Trump's win. And it says, "Congrats, Professor. Good call," in handwriting with a big Sharpie signature, Donald J. Trump. How about that?
That's great.
He obviously didn't get to my next prediction, which was that he'd be impeached.
Right. And you were a big supporter.
In 2016, he'd be elected and impeached.
And you were a big supporter of the Democrats doing impeachment.
I was a big supporter of impeachment, absolutely.
Yeah.
Of course, I wrote the book.
Right.
For impeachment, over 2 years before the impeachment.
That's fantastic. So, Professor Lichtman, we're heading towards the end of our conversation. Is there a question you wanted me to ask you that I didn't get to? Was there something you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I want to say one thing. Donald Trump's response to the pandemic was about as bad as it possibly could be. Even after he was warned, he played golf 6 times and held 8 political rallies with people shoulder to shoulder and didn't do the preparation necessary to deal with the pandemic. All of that's correct. But there's something much deeper going on here that I point out in my book in April 2017, which goes back to the beginning of the Trump administration. And that is the Trump war on truth. It's not just a war on science, although the war on science is part of that. It is the war on truth. Trump not only lies, doesn't believe in truth or even reality. Truth and reality for Trump is what serves him at the moment. Let's not forget, how did he break into politics in the first place? On the back of the biggest, most protracted, worst lie in American history, that our first African-American president, Barack Obama, was illegitimate because he was really born in Africa, not Hawaii. And he mongered that lie for 5 years until in one sentence he kind of repudiated. This is the real problem, the war on truth and reality. You can use alternative facts, phony facts. They may work for your enablers among Republicans in the Senate. They cannot work against a pandemic. And so the incredibly irresponsible, ineffective response goes deeply into the very core of what Trump and his administration is all about.
Well said. Well said. Are you working on any new projects?
I am. I'm working on a book on pandemics called Pandemic Paradoxes, Predictions for a Better Future, pointing out how pandemics pose all these paradoxes, social reform versus reaction, science versus quackery, technology versus retrogression, health versus morbidity. All of these paradoxes arise in every major pandemic, and I analyze these paradoxes and point out the way in which we can resolve them for a much better future. For example, a future in which we have much less of a carbon footprint, in which we have fewer dangerous jobs, in which we have better health care, better science.
I imagine funding public health agencies would help.
Yeah, that, we can go on this, but that was another issue in the Trump administration was defunding public health, dismantling the pandemic office and the National Security Council. And, the former head of that office has made it clear what a disaster that was. But he doesn't care. You got to understand that. He doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him because for Trump, everything begins and ends with Trump.
Well said again. Well, Professor Allan J. Lichtman, thanks for coming on the show. Where can people find you online, sir?
Yes. My Twitter handle is @Allan Lichtman. And my email, probably shouldn't. Should I give out my email?
You are the professional, sir. You may do what you wish.
expertal47@gmail.com. I welcome all legitimate questions and inquiries.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again. This has been a lot of fun, sir.